Welcome to our annual Practicum Palooza. I think this is our biggest ever. We have 20 different presentations representing 23 organizations, from Taipei and London to Providence and Wyoming and every place in between. And just reading your blog entries, it seems like we have a lot of really interesting presentations. So I'm not going to take a lot of time standing here. Let's just get started. Susan, do you want to say anything?
I don't.
Okay.
This is, Steve and I have agreed that this is our one of our favorite, maybe the favorite event of the year. It's just wonderful, and I didn't get a chance to read the summer Practicum blog, to which those people who are on Practicums did contribute, and those of you who are doing them next summer will contribute next summer, but I hear it was the best ever. And so these will be great. It's always fun. Thank you.
And I would like to ask the second-year students to talk with the first-year students about your experiences over the summer, but not only what you did, but how you arrived at your decisions and how you went about setting up your practicums. I think that sort of continuity in institutional knowledge is really important to this program. So I sent out the order yesterday, did a little tweaking to make sure everyone fit this into their schedules. You each have 5 minutes to present. I have a timer on my phone. I'll stand up at 4 minutes. And I don't know, I'll make a noise or something in 5 minutes. Hopefully I won't have to, but inevitably someone's going to run over. I don't want the timing of this to be the tail that wags the dog, but we do have a lot of presentations and we want to give everyone an equal chance to talk about their summer without feeling under pressure. If there's time, we'll do some Q&A. Sabina has very efficiently organized the presentation, so you should be able to just come right up and get your presentation loaded. So Mark is going to go first, unless there's any questions. All right, let's just get started. We will break for lunch at about 12:30.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be kicking off the Palooza. So for those who don't know me, my name is Mark Putterman. I'm a second-year PhD student in American Studies and doing Public Humanities Masters. So I'm going to be sharing 5 quick learnings from my summer at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. The first is that participatory curation means rethinking project timelines. And so my main project at the APA Center was trying to work alongside undergraduate student activists to create a digital exhibition and resource bank documenting their work trying to advocate for Asian American Studies programs on their respective campuses. This was a complicated thing to be doing during summer vacation because students have lives and are often trying to recharge over the summer. And so it was a struggle for me to navigate my desire to move the project forward and to make curatorial decisions and keep things going on sort of my imagined timeline at the same time as taking seriously my charge to be engaging with these undergraduate students as co-curators. So I think realizing I needed to adjust my expectations and our project timeline accordingly was a very tangible learning when it comes to these sort of more engaged curatorial practices. Number 2 is to follow your interests even when they feel like a distraction. So because this exhibit on student activism was sort of delayed due to corresponding with students over the summer being a slow process, I sort of got pulled into this side project, which at first felt very much like a distraction because I happened to visit an exhibit at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum on DC housing activism and was really interested in this one caption I saw for a newsletter called Eastern Wind that was published out of DC Chinatown in the early 1970s. And so I ended up actually working with the Anacostia to research and process a new collection that they had acquired in the process of doing this exhibit. And so I had to sort of navigate my own commitments and expectations working at the APA Center to sort of take some time off and it sort of felt like playing hooky to go over to the Anacostia and do this other research. But in the end, it was a really fruitful and rewarding experience, so I'm glad I sort of went down that rabbit hole. Number 3, everything is political even when it's not supposed to be. So I think people might have seen my post on the Practicum blog, in which I was sort of reflecting on learning the maybe obvious reality that as a federally funded institution, the Smithsonian, including the APA Center, isn't allowed to take political stances or partisan stances. And so that was very surprising to me, because really everything that we do at the APA Center is intensely political. And I think it's impossible to do Asian American history without being political. And so it was something for me to navigate, thinking about how to take political stances without sort of crossing this threshold of what is partisan or not. And obviously, I think the policy to not be partisan is political in and of itself. But an interesting example that I found useful of navigating this line is a video that the APA Center produced called Letters from Camp, in which Muslim American youth read letters that incarcerated Japanese Americans had written when they were interned during World War II. And so this is sort of a fascinating example of something that's clearly political, but not partisan in a way it's not supposed to be under the Smithsonian. Number 4, all research is personal, sometimes surprisingly so. So I believe that, our personal subject position has huge implications for the way we approach research and curation and all this work. But sometimes things get even more personal than you might think. So I was really shocked when I started doing some research at the Anacostia Museum with their Eastern Wind publication to see sort of the first thing I saw when I went into archives and opened up the first issue of the newsletter was my mom's name. So it turns out that my mom was a contributor to this newsletter in the early 1970s when she was in her 20s living in DC. And so it was an incredible surprise and really interesting for me to think about sort of intergenerational memory and political memory and the things that get passed down and not. For me to make this discovery not from like talking to my mom and her telling me about it, but from going into the archives and seeing her name. And luckily was able to start a conversation based on that. Number 5 is to thank your friendly neighborhood archivist. I'm not trained as an archivist. I had no background in archival processing, but ended up helping to process this very small collection to make it publicly accessible. It's now online through the Smithsonian Virtual Archive. And so I think when we talk about like accessibility and community engagement and public-facing work, a lot of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes isn't talked about as much. So for me, it was a huge learning to think about the nuts and bolts behind processing these collections and making them publicly available. And I think I'm out of time, so thank you.
We have time for a question.
What did your mom say about you?
That's a great question. So my mom has a notoriously bad memory, and she didn't remember a lot specifically. She said it sounded familiar. I sent her some screenshots of the articles that she had written, and she said, well, it definitely sounds like my writing, but I don't remember writing it. So yeah, it was interesting to see, like, for me, this is such like an iconic moment in Asian American history, and for her, it was sort of like this thing she did before she went to law school. And I was actually able to talk with some other members of this group, Eastern Wind, and they did remember my mom, so that was cool. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm going to kind of keep it rustic and go off notes. First, clip this thing. Oh, color. Okay, thanks. So, just to give you a brief sketch of my practicum, it started as a plan for a public history exhibition on the history of planning in Providence, history of city planning in Providence in the late 20th century. And it kind of blossomed over the course of the summer and our brainstorming together into a 3-year grassroots community planning effort. that will be citywide. So my role was mostly in kind of helping to develop ideas and writing grants and securing partners. And I worked probably 90% alone and maybe 10% with the director of the Congress for the New Urbanism, whose name is Jen, and the other part of that 10% was attending meetings with prospective partners and et cetera, and building connections with the greater Providence community. But again, it was about 90% just me kind of hopping from one coffee shop to another and working on the laptop. So it was unusual in that way, and for better or worse. But a lot of my, my 5 things I learned come out of that experience. And the first is to make good on pledges for partnership or support while the interest in conversation is still fresh. Because I think, if you wait too long, people do get busy and they may want to remain involved, but realistically they can't. And or it just, it may get a little awkward if someone says, yeah, I'd love to help, and you're not kind of calling them in until a year later. The other thing that I kind of came to realize over the course of the summer writing a lot of grants is that grant writing is not creative writing. It calls on different skills. It calls on different parts of the brain. I don't want to say more laborious, but I think it's more comparable in terms of the skills that it summons to cover letter writing or resume building. You have an idea, you have this fire, that's inspiring and pushing you to do it, but you're kind of transferring that into a language. You're selling it, in other words, and I feel like that's a different skill set. The other thing, the third thing is to brainstorm with collaborators frequently, and kind of find a balance between brainstorming and making lists and making plans. And part of that, I think, is that sometimes brainstorming or just having a freestyle conversation with people who you're working with is more productive than writing to-do lists. Like my first inclination when I feel like, oh, what's next is to write a to-do list. And that's helpful, but sometimes you just need to keep it open and keep it loose and just talk to people instead. Because I feel like for us, the best ideas came out of those like more casual conversations versus me sitting, at 10 in the morning writing my list. The fourth thing is to be open to radical revision. Like in the case of our project, the working idea was for an exhibition for the first 4 months that we were meeting. And it was only during the summer, again, through a kind of freestyle conversation that we realized, well, what we find interesting about past plans, we could more effectively or more generatively bring out through making another one. And so the idea really took a 180 pretty far along. But I'm glad that we were open to that, and I'm excited for what it's going to be. And the last thing is kind of obvious, but just to step away at regular intervals. For me, I will get up from my work and then go look out the window or make some toast or whatever, but with this kind of guilty feeling of, oh, I should be at the computer. And I've been kind of evangelical about this lately, but I've started using the Pomodoro method, where you work for 25 minutes, take 5 minutes off, and I find that is just so liberating, to structure it like that. So I think I'm out of time.
You have about 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Does anyone have any questions? Well, thank you so much. I have TA duties at 12, so I just in advance, I don't mean to be rude, but I'll be coming back. So, thank you.
Okay. So today, I'm going to be talking about the 5 things I learned from my summer fellowship at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. and you will find that I do not have many pictures from my time there, nor many slides. But if I turn this, the 5 things I learned. So the first thing I learned was to listen to your body. Only you know when you've had enough. So I think, as many of you know from the blog post, I was commuting every day to and from Salem, Massachusetts, which is very tiring, and had to learn how to schedule in time for self-care, because I think that, or for rest, because I think that often I was feeling very tired, and I thought I could do more than I actually could. So the second thing I learned was saying no is a form of self-care, and I think that often while you are, interning someplace, you will be asked some requests that seem unrealistic or unfair or like it's too much, and that you can say no. And I didn't know that before I went into it, and I think I needed other people to advocate for me because I could not advocate for myself. And then the third thing I learned is that not everyone will be invested in you, and to seek out those who are. And I think that the people who were invested in me were not who I originally came in thinking were. And that was really eye-opening to learn. The fourth thing that I learned was that there are jobs inside the museum that I had not possibly imagined until I was in the institution. I think that often coming from a background where you don't go to museums, you think of the I thought of the stereotypical jobs, and I didn't realize that there were ways to combine community work with a job in the institution. And then the last thing I learned was to not get so caught up in the bad that I was unable to see the good, because I think that often I was dwelling on some of the negative experiences that I had, and I was unable to see that I was gaining practical experience that would benefit me in the long run. And so it's a perspective shift that was really important and helped me to get through the summer. Thank you.
Thank you. We have lots of time for questions.
I just have a comment that number 3 is one of the ones that Bob Lee, my friend, faculty member in American Studies, that's one of the ones that his father, early on in his career when he was an MA student in Berkeley, took Bob in the chair of the department out to dinner. I may have the story wrong, but in any event, it was a great piece of advice, which is that you don't know where your allies are. You should be open to finding allies in a range of different places, because you're never when you walk into a situation, you're never sure who will be your ally, but be open to finding them.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes you think that those who you are directly under are supposed to be those people, and it doesn't have to be. So,
It's a big world out there.
Yeah.
There's lots of people who work at universities, who work at museums, and there's lots of places to find support.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a brutal commute. You were driving from Providence every day?
I was taking the commuter rail. I took 2 commuter rails, so one to Boston and the next to Salem. So, yeah.
Did you have any time to sort of explore or engage with Salem, or and if so, did you find that useful?
So I had some time because they did provide some housing for a bit of it, so I was able to explore. But the days that I was commuting, I just wanted to get home and fast and go to sleep. So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Hey guys, I'm Bella. So I spent my summer in New York and working on a couple of projects. So like the first place I worked in is a gallery called Chambers Fine Art Gallery. And the first thing I know is like gallery isn't really my thing. It's really funny. This gallery is focused on like contemporary Chinese art. There are only 4 people in the office. It's really kind of cruel for me to find out like everything is based on profit. It's like when we're doing public program, the public program is supposed to like collaborating with people with a similar like connection, so we can bring more connection in to like sell more hours. So that's like the basic tone of it, and I just feel like everything's too fixed. They don't have the minute to like stop to think about their mission in the future. So there's literally not too much space for me to propose something that's gonna happen in the summer. That was my experience. This is the event that we had this summer. It was fun. But at the same time, I really enjoy my work in China Institute, which is like a nonprofit culture institution. They're like focusing on like promoting Chinese business, art, and culture to the American audience. And what I really love about it is the people surrounding me. My bosses are so nice. Like they believe me a lot. They'll listen to my opinions, and they really let me to do their social media to change the tone a little bit to be more playful and attracting like young audiences. So I feel like surrounded by those people really helped me to grow and also helped me to like practice a lot. The third thing I learned is to like you should hang out more, because I feel like my community is really outside the workplace sometimes. I happen to know a lot of Asian American community outside the workplace, and where we're like working together. So I happened to introduce my friend outside to China Institute to collaborate on projects, and we're proposing on curation together, which didn't work out this summer in New York because it's so hard to find a space, but it's really nice to have those connections. The fourth thing I learned is to say yes more on that, because I feel like the same thing with juggling. Like sometimes you overwork yourself, but like because I feel like this FOMO in New York, everybody's doing so much, and I was like I couldn't keep up. So I always tell people like, oh, I like doing marketing for like our platforms and stuff. So like I happened to find 2 more like side jobs, working on Output, which is like a Chinese contemporary digital media art like in Shanghai. They need somebody to do their social media in America, so I was helping them with it. And on the other hand, I was like doing the traveling campaign, helping Chinese video creators to like engage in this activity, this like campaign, and also like getting fundings to like travel more and like promoting like their videos. The last thing I learned is like bad things can be good, because like in the beginning of the summer, I was really sad because I was turned down by at least 10 institutions that I wanted to be this summer. So I ended up with these 2 places. I wasn't really sure what they're like, but this summer I ended up like learning more than I ever expected. So I feel like you shouldn't be disappointed in the first place. You should just keep being like positive and optimistic. Things might turn around. Yeah, that's it. The 5 things I learned this summer. Thank you.
Questions?
How did you juggle 4 different projects? Sorry, I'm
It's kind of like, it's like I do the 2 other things I'm mostly at home and during the weekend, but also like even like I'm at work, for example, in a gallery, sometimes I just don't have too much to do. I would just work on my own projects too. So like a little bit of like just jump around, kind of like.
She doesn't really have an answer to that. I've asked that question several times, and it's just, she seems to be able to do that. I can't do it, but this was exactly my question. How do you do that?
But that's the thing. I feel like because a lot of work I do is on social media, it's like you're playing your phone all the time, and sometimes when you're promoting things, you're just like, okay, I remember I'm gonna do this. I just do it. So like it's easier when you're working like social media stuff. I feel like
Makes it
that's
part of her life.
yeah.
Thank
Great.
you, Bella.
Thank you guys.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name's Ruby, and I spent my practicum in 2 places this summer. I did the first half in Taiwan on a research project with some students from Brown, including Jasmine, and then my second half of it I spent in London doing research with a curator and a university professor at UCL. So the first thing that I learned was that it's very important to learn the language when you go to a new place. We were functioning under the impression that we could get around Taiwan with just English, which is true, but there was just so much that was lost from not knowing Mandarin. It was a happy coincidence that I do know Mandarin, but it was not like I went into the program, like I went to the project because I'm familiar with the language. And so just an example, like we were doing research at the National Museum of Taiwan History in Tainan, and this is one of the interactives that they had. And you can kind of tell that it's a map and it like corresponds to some things, but there's just so much that's lost when you don't know what's being said. And you need to know the history and the cultural context. And again, I was very lucky to stumble into the fact that Taiwan is very similar to Singapore in a lot of ways, but I felt very guilty that I didn't know enough. And so like on train rides between different cities, I was like doing readings and learning more about the culture and listening to podcasts and all of that. But it would have been way better if I hadn't been so arrogant and gone in fully prepared. The next thing is that plans change overnight. This is, we stumbled into a gallery, and this is one of the things that they had up. But we went into the project sort of assuming that we were going to borrow a fully done exhibition and bring it to Providence. And we get there, and it turns out that because of communication breakdown, because of language, the museum curators were like, we're not loaning you anything, or we don't have anything to loan you. And that was day 2 of our trip, which was 2 weeks long. So we had to quickly reformulate and think about what it was that we wanted to get out of our research trip and who we wanted to speak to and how we were going to move forward from that gigantic diversion. We will be working on this project all this semester, so if you're interested to find out what we are going to be doing, you can talk to me or Jasmine. The next thing is it's important to use social media. So I don't know if any of you have seen this tweet. It's from the Museum of English Rural Life. And they went super viral in April and are still like one of the best social media presences I've seen for a museum. And when I was in London, I went to this thing called Museums Show Off, where a bunch of different museum professionals gather and talk about things that they've successfully done. And this is when I attended this talk where Adam, who is a social media person for this museum, was talking about it. And a lot of the things that I ended up going to in London, the people I ended up speaking to in London, I found via social media because I am not from there. I didn't really have that many connections. This is another thing. Last semester, I spoke to John for the Public Work podcast that comes out of the JNBC, and I connected with him via Twitter initially, and I ended up meeting him and visiting the virtual museum while I was in London, because that's where he was. I'd also be happy to talk about this at another time. There's no picture for this, but I also learned that institutional access was incredibly important, and it's very difficult to be international because I really wanted to be in London this summer for professional reasons and personal reasons. It was really important for me because of the museums that I wanted to visit were all free in London. They were not going to be free if I stayed in the US. A lot of the connections that I wanted to make for personal projects that I've been working on were in London. So I ended up there on a tourist visa, which I was lucky to have 90 days for. But I had no work visa, which meant that my mission to find full-time work was basically impossible. And I ended up working on a research project with UCL, the University College London, but a lot of things were closed off to me. Like I couldn't go to any of the meetings that we had with partner museums. It was a project learning about how museums were doing things, but I couldn't go to the meetings because I didn't have clearance because I wasn't employed by the university. So I ended up doing lots of work by myself. And I didn't have access to the UCL library because I wasn't a student. Thankfully, I had access to the Brown Library, but if I had been an independent researcher, this would have been like an impossible summer. So that was very important. And I learned that solo work is really lonely. So moving to London was maybe the 4th time in the last 5 years that I've moved to a new country by myself, and it doesn't get easier. And so I really had to find a network outside of, I guess, my work, which was completely by myself because my supervisor was on holiday the whole time. So these 3 people I had never met before the summer, but they were all Singaporean artists who were based in London when I was there. And it goes back to my point about social media being important. I met up with a lot of people in the Singaporean diaspora and a lot of people doing cool things in museums that I'd love to talk about another time. But I had to connect with them like via social media and really put myself out there and be like, hi, I like your work. Would you like to grab Chinese food or grab a coffee? That's it. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Questions?
Why not? That's cool too. My voice hurts. Oh, damn it, Julia.
No, I guess I'm just, as someone with like limited facility in another language, I feel like there is that running, use the word arrogant assumption of like, oh, I speak English, it'll be fine, it'll work out. I'm just wondering if you could say more about your perspective as someone who is bilingual, seeing those, in Taiwan, kind of
Yeah.
seeing the breakdowns in the project communication, like what you saw as most evident, I guess?
Everybody that we met in Taiwan was exceedingly kind and friendly and wanted to be very accommodating to the fact that we were coming from the US, and they assumed we wouldn't be able to speak the language, and they were all very, like, our contacts were very pleasantly surprised that me and another student were fairly conversant. I wouldn't call myself fluent, but enough to get around, and enough to read like museum labels and stuff. I feel like the project would have gone over very messily if we hadn't had, we had enough for them to be like, oh, we have no objects to give you in English, but things like explaining why we were doing what we were doing, the purposes of us actually being in the country, and our reservations, their reservations, that was easier to say in a native language to our contacts. And then people just loosen up a little bit more, because when you come from, especially when you come from the US or another country that is a lot bigger than your host country, people are very polite to you and they want to make it accommodating for you. But being able to be like, it's cool, like I get your limitations, opened up a lot more honesty and made it more of a human connection than an institution to institution connection.
I had really good luck with translators. So working with students as collaborators in the place where I'm working. In some ways, the way you function for the group, so a local person, and all either paid or they're getting internship credit or some way in which to compensate it. But then they can become the bridge that does just what you say. They explain both sides to each other.
Thank you, Ruby.
Oh, Connor.
I'm not going to ask you more later, but I'm just curious about how you managed that sort of lack of access to the professional world that was related to your visa status, and if you felt, in hindsight, if you would have done anything differently, or if you felt was it limiting to the point that it limited your experience, or were you able to work around it?
I got a lot out of my summer in London professionally, outside of doing full-time work. So I can talk to you about this more, but I work in publishing and I work a lot with the Singaporean art scene. And so I connected with a lot of people from Singapore working in the UK, and that was incredibly generative. And I could do that, outside of being paid, because it was not related to my visa status. So for that reason, I would definitely do London all over again. But it was the fact that I needed to find full-time work for the practicum that greatly limited my options, and I don't think there was any way I could have worked around it. It's a tough time now to be foreign. Yeah. Thank you.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Saglio, and this summer I interned at Mystic Seaport Museum up in Mystic, Connecticut. As part of a long-running internship program they have, I was one of 6 interns they had this summer. So while I was there, I split my time between the interpretation department, where I worked on the museum floor, interacting with visitors, and in the education department, where I created teacher resources for their brand new virtual role player program. All of that is going to be up by the end of October, and I'm really excited. For those of you who might not know, Mystic Seaport Museum is a maritime history museum that explores the relationship between America and the sea. They have a lot of types of exhibits. They have a little bit of something for everyone. If you've never been or haven't been recently, I do suggest going to check it out, just because I only have 5 minutes and I can't run through it all. This past summer was a really exciting time to be there, though, because in June they underwent a total rebrand and rolled out a brand new strategic plan that focused on ways to make the institution more inclusive and bring in new audiences. It was really hard work to pick just 5 things to talk about today, because I really did learn a lot. But I did manage to whittle my list down, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share that with you. Kind of starting us off is probably the simplest and most important lesson I learned, is that all projects start somewhere, whether they're big or they're small. So often I found, both in my work that I was doing personally and the work that the institution was trying to do, they were so focused on the enormity of the task and what the final picture needed to be that they forgot that progress happens in stages. And so often we found projects that were kind of paralyzed and stuck and didn't know how to start moving forward, because they forgot that you have to start small and that you have to allow it to grow.
Something else I learned was don't ever hold on to anything too tightly. Projects are changing, the needs of institutions change, the needs of visitors change. So at all points, any project I worked on, whether it was big or small, meant that we needed to constantly be making adjustments. And especially in an environment that is so collaborative like the Seaport, it was really important that I didn't get focused on what something should be, but what something could be. And we had, for every example I saw where that radical revision that Sam was talking about had a payoff, we saw a space that desperately needed that, but somebody was holding on a little too tight. So I don't have to tell you most of this, but working with the public is a challenge. On more than one occasion this summer, I repeatedly had to tell myself that you never have to do today again. This is an SOS text I sent out to my fellow interns after a really challenging day in the Children's Museum there they have that never ended. But with that said though, for every challenging visitor I had, there was a great one. And working with the public isn't all sunshine and rainbows, but it can be incredibly rewarding. And I had to keep reminding myself that for every time I said I never have to do today again, I had a great moment where I reminded myself that I never get to do today again. So each day was a little bit different. Something else I learned was that you should say yes until you're ready to say no. I met a lot of people this summer. My fellow interns and I had the opportunity to not only work with people and meet with higher-ups within our institution, but they sent us to a lot of different places to talk to a lot of different people. And just time and time again, people kept saying that their number one bit of professional advice for people that were emerging museum professionals was to say yes to everything that came your way, even if it seemed scary. And while this is a tremendously helpful way of thinking about the world, I also learned that it's okay to say no, because I'm already a yes person. I say yes all the time. I love saying yes. But both my first year in grad school and really this summer, it was an important lesson for me in the power of learning to say no. No, I can't take that on too. No, that's the wrong opportunity for me. No, unfortunately, I can't attend. And recognizing that sometimes the answer is no, I just want to go home and watch Netflix. I worked full time. I worked 3 jobs while I was there that summer. It was a lot. And for me, learning to say no made me feel powerful, and it was a form of self-care, and was the best decision I learned to make throughout the summer. So by far the coolest thing about the Seaport is that they don't just preserve things, they preserve skills. So they preserve a series of maritime skills. So while I was there, I learned not only the ins and outs of working in the museum, I just learned a lot of cool things related to the maritime experience. I learned to create scrimshaw. I learned to carve wood. I learned to climb the rigging on a 19th century tall ship. I did not climb all the way up to the top, just to clarify. I learned how to use a sextant. And I learned all about boats. I lived on a boat for a couple weeks, learned that the most efficient way to plug a leak is with a diaper, that technically boats are always sinking, it's just a matter of how fast you pump the water out. And while I loved working at the museum and even accepted a second internship with them this fall, I've definitely learned that I am best suited for a life on dry land. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions. Have any questions? Cool.
So the boat that you lived on, was that historic vessel or?
It was historic in the sense that it was from the 1970s and had not been updated since. It was all mirrored and wood paneling. So it was historic.
I was sort of hoping you would say it was a whaling vessel or something.
No, you can. The summer camps get to sleep on the merchant training ship from the 19th century, so they have a fun boat experience.
Was that an optional thing, or was it required, or was it just convenient?
It was strongly encouraged, and I found that I did not enjoy it. I get incredibly motion sick. There was a lot of problems with the boat. It did try to sink 3 times this summer. And we had a Wi-Fi problem. I was working 3 jobs remotely, so just trying to finagle that. I just ended up commuting home back and forth, which ended up being a really great decision. That was one of those learn to say no things. Nope, I'm just gonna go home now. So, are there any other questions? Unclip my microphone.
All right, so I worked this summer at the Cedar Canal National Historic Park, specifically Great Falls, which is in Maryland, right near DC, conveniently close to where I live, so good motivation. But I went in as a costume historian, and I kind of ended up as a collections manager as well, so it was interesting. Number 1, people are really stuck in their ways, especially when they've been there since 1995. I found the two older interpreters that I worked with very frequently were incredible wells of knowledge, and they were really nice people. They did great around the public, but when we tried to, we being me and two other newer workers, when we tried to get them to open their minds a little bit and talk about new forms of public programming and interpretation, and in my case, costume history, they were not so forgiving. So this is a little quote that the first guy said to me on my first day, just walked into my office and said, "You can't make me wear woolen underwear," and walked right out. Turned out to be a great guy, but wow, that was a little weird. Number two, all these are quotes as best as I can get them, by the way. My supervisor tried the best he could to manage things that he didn't really know about, and it got a little bothersome. I'm sure you've all had someone like that. But when I realized what his worries were, and when I tried to just sit down and think about what he didn't know, what he wanted to know, and what I could do to help him on that, it got a lot easier. So once we started clearly explaining our goals and our process, he got better about it. So, and that's our little substitute photo. So don't do this in a way that bores you, going above and beyond your job description. A couple people have talked about this already, but it's only worth it if you enjoy it. Kind of like what was said earlier about getting distracted, but follow it up anyway. We had an attic in our tavern house that we worked out of, and one of the other seasonals and I went up there one day to look for cooking program implements and found walnut molds that we then pursued down the rabbit hole of research and found out that it was a cooking thing for almond paste that had been around since the Elizabethan era. So fun things, and now we get to talk about that in interpretive programs. Okay, this is more general life advice. I'm in the plaid in the back. I made a few garments for interpretation because I got myself sucked into one of the programs every Sunday about cooking. So I made a few garments early on, and the materials and techniques that I learned about when I was making this really influenced my own casual and work wardrobe during the summer that wasn't 19th century. So, and I hate summer. And this was the first year that I didn't absolutely loathe it, because the things I learned from history and from working in 115 degrees and 95% humidity taught me so much about how to get through it in my own life. So I arrived at my internship expecting to spend about a bit of time making sure the wardrobe was up to snuff. They obviously had a living history program, as you've seen in pictures, and most of the time doing research. I really wanted to do research about the kind of local histories and see what was different about a canal in Maryland versus, say, the Erie Canal. Didn't get there because I walked into the wardrobe and was horrified. And this was from a position where I'd only recently been researching this time period. I did not have a base of knowledge really to work off of, and I could still tell it was just heinous. So I spent the majority of my summer just going through that wardrobe, continuously doing research on kind of the basics instead of the intricacies and what I was hoping to be interested in. It turned out being really interesting anyway. I now have a massive Pinterest board of 1865 to 75 clothing, so I could show interpreters what they really should be wearing. And it turned out really interestingly, but the worst part was just that I asked when was the inventory done, and they said, oh yeah, it was just redone in January. This is an inventory that listed like white chemises, undergarments, as a red men's shirt. It was incredible. So, and I knew my research wouldn't be nearly as helpful, the research that I wanted to do, if the wardrobe, just the basic line of defense here was awful. So I knew what I needed to do, and I did it, and it turned out being really worth it. I interfaced a lot more with the interpreters than I would have otherwise. And number 6, bonus, if you can work at a place that feeds you, and on your lunch break you can just walk to a waterfall and enjoy, everybody is happier. So.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and this summer I worked at Redux Contemporary Art Center, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. I was technically the education intern, but as I'll talk about a little bit, I did kind of everything. So this summer I learned how to use your words. This is something my parents have been telling me my entire life because I'm very unassertive and I don't ask for what I want. So I learned to use my words because when I came to Redux, I had like one real project planned, doing this like monuments program, but that's something I've already spent a lot of time thinking about and planning for. So planning the program took like the first week of my summer, and I had to figure out what else to do with my time. So I used my words and I asked for lots of other projects. I said yes to pretty much everything that was thrown my way, and it was great because I was like running the social media, I was organizing archives, I was helping some of the resident artists in their studios, I was running camps sometimes, and I helped with kind of all the after hours events and programming, which was really interesting. I kind of got to have my hand in a little bit of everything, which I loved. And because I used my words, the other like really exciting thing I got to do was write grants. So I learned how to fund an organization. And this is Dwayne. He's the resident Redux dog. And we handed him a stack of donation cash and he took it in his mouth. We thought it was great. So I learned a lot about funding an organization. I got to write 2 grants, one for a local foundation and one for a much bigger, more corporate foundation. We got the first one. We're waiting to hear about the second. And so it was really interesting. I think Sam already talked about kind of the difference of writing a grant from writing anything else was interesting to learn. At the same time, Redux is also running like one of those Facebook donation campaigns. So it's interesting to learn more about that and kind of the limitations to that kind of fundraising, because we were doing really well for a while and then it totally petered off. And how do you like maintain that kind of marketing and social media to fund your organization? I also learned how to paint and spackle and then some. So Redux has a big gallery space and the exhibits change every 6 to 8 weeks. So I was there for 2 different turnovers of exhibits, and in my first week I painted the entire gallery this really dark gray that you see on the left, and then about 6 weeks later I had to paint it all white again. So I got really good at painting and spackling, using an electric sander, a level, all those kinds of things. So it was really interesting to learn about the side of exhibits that you maybe don't necessarily think about. I'd done, curating and interpretation before, but the like physical aspects of exhibits was interesting and really tiring to learn. I learned to roll with some of the programming punches. I'm not a very go with the flow person. And the monuments workshop that I was running, they're always going to hit snags. So, I didn't get to work necessarily with the kids the age I wanted to work with at the times I wanted to work with them. It was so hot the days we did this, and I'd been planning for these like monument walking tours that we could not possibly do as long as I wanted to because it was 100+ degrees outside. So we had to come up with some other activities. I made them write me proposals for their monuments, which was what this is on the left. This is his proposal for his memorial to the sport of squash, which is very important to him and really impacted his life. So just kind of being a little more go with the flow. It's one of the things I learned. And lastly is not a how-to, but something that was really reaffirmed this summer, and it's that kids rock. These are some of my tinies that I worked with this summer, and I've worked with kids my whole life, like since I babysat as a middle schooler, and sometimes when I'm not working with kids, it's hard to remember why I like working with kids. It's really exhausting and frustrating, but it's so fun and so weird and exciting because they're weird and exciting. So this summer just reaffirmed that whatever I do next, I'd like to be able to work with kids in some capacity because it keeps things super interesting and high energy, and it keeps you super high energy or forces you to be super high energy. So that's about it.
Questions?
Yes.
I guess, I mean, you mentioned that you work on thinking about personal monuments a lot. I know you and Holly did the program during Gallery Lab, and I guess I'm wondering if anything about this current iteration shifted how you're thinking about that?
I guess the shift was that when Molly and I did the exhibit about monuments, we were really only talking to grown-ups. And so doing it with kids was really interesting because, and this is why I wanted to do it with older kids, but I'm glad I got to do it. The kids in my workshops ran the gamut. There were like kids age 8 to age 18. So older kids really got it, and they got kind of the concept I was asking for of like, what is monument worthy to you? But it was really interesting with like 8-year-olds who just wanted to like make a sculpture of their house because they loved their house or they loved their mom. So I think it's just really, yeah, I loved it, and I loved, it was a little less serious doing it with kids. I finally got some like really silly monuments, like monument to my favorite foods, which was a big mural of like pizza and hot dogs and hamburgers. So yeah, just kind of that monuments can be fun and don't have to be quite so awful. Yeah. Great, thanks.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Molly. And this summer, I was in Denver, Colorado, and I was working with 2 different nonprofit organizations. The first one was Western States Art Federation, and the second one was Rhino Art District. And it was a really interesting summer because these 2 projects were very different. Working with West staff was mostly me doing solo work and then popping in occasionally and giving a presentation. And then working with Rhino was working with a 4.5-person staff, like doing everything with them and really taking ownership of a project that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have been there this summer. So one thing I learned was that working with an organization's realities to get closer to visions is complicated. So with West staff, what I was doing is I was creating sort of evaluations of their current public art archive, which is a website that these organizations and many others have artwork on, and it's sort of the only website of its kind, and it's a resource for not only archiving, but making public art available. And so what I was doing is I was evaluating, I was trying to create proposals for an education portal that would make the public art archive mission of making art more public possible. And so doing that, I spoke with a bunch of different organizations, even Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, which is funny because it's Western States Arts Federation, but this project is sort of all-encompassing. And it was sort of balancing, talking to these different organizations and hearing what they wanted from the archive, hearing what the West Staff organization needed from the archive in order for it to run and for them to make money from it, and then thinking about creating things that would push it further towards like a vision of creating opportunity and access and use for public art. So this was from my work with Rhino Art District, and what I was doing this summer is I was programming and coordinating a pop-up park. And so a big lesson I learned is that investing in people is important. So for this project, I was going out, I was talking to everyone in the neighborhood pretty much, and all sorts of groups in Denver, seeing if people were interested in using the space for some sort of program, some sort of event, doing something, collaborating with us, sponsoring an event, which seemed really like daunting at first, but really paid off when people connected me to other people, and then people checked in, and people ended up donating time and resource. So this picture here, the mural on the ground was done by a Denver artist. And then we have all these donated planters that are being planted, and then umbrellas and tables. So sort of piecing everything together and how important people are in that process. So this was an interesting summer because the 2 projects I was working on had 2 very different timelines. For West staff, re-envisioning their public art archive is a long process. What I was doing is sort of the first step in sort of showing that there are other ways to use this website and innovate with it. And so I ended up giving a presentation of the research I did and my proposals to them, but it's still sort of, being processed. And the new website isn't going to be made, or even these portals won't be added to it for maybe like 2 years. So there wasn't like a big timeline stress on that. Working with Rhino Art District, I arrived mid-May, and we were trying to get programming to start at the beginning of June. So the park itself didn't, this is an image from the website of what they had rendered it to look like. A lot of these pieces like came together later, so it was this weird balance of getting people on our calendar to start these programs, but then the space wasn't really prepared to host programs, and sort of navigating that stress and having a totally different timeline. Not everything goes according to plan, and it's okay. So sort of thinking back with my experience with Rhino Art District, it was really interesting because Rhino Art District is also a business development district and a general improvement district, which is unusual. And one of the things we did is we had a big street party for a road that had been redone. There are all these balloons over here that I was delivering to businesses. I had like bundled them perfectly by fives. I stepped outside, the wind happened, and it was a situation. And then lastly, it matters who you work with. So here am I with the people at Rhino Art District. We did a surprise outing. We went boating on a reservoir. I was sort of on the brink of throwing up the entire time. But it was really fun, and also people are important. I got these opportunities this summer from networking with alumni in this program. So it matters who you work with, it matters who you talk to. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay, I've got a mic up for this performance. Don't worry, this isn't a real play. It's just... All right, so hello, I'm Jasmine. So my summer practicum, a play in 3 acts. I titled my presentation this because I did my practicum in 3 different places doing 3 different projects. And the first one, wow, I went to Taiwan, surprise, with Ruby. As Ruby mentioned, we were doing a project that took us to Taiwan. The lesson I learned from this is how public humanities work connects internationally, and that in this process, it can be very confusing, but also an amazing opportunity. The way that we thought about this project, or how it was presented and how we understood it before we left, and then what it actually ended up being, were very different. But that in itself was a great learning experience. It was also a really good experience in listening. It's really, really important to listen, no matter where you are, but especially if you are working internationally, and to eat as much food as you possibly can. And then the third thing is that this is a project that we did with a couple of undergrads, and in this, I was kind of surprised to realize how much these undergrads were kind of relying on us. This is their first contact with public humanities work, and like trying to make that a valuable experience for them and for ourselves. And this is all of us at the ocean, which was a great moment. So then the next project I did was at an organization called Heart of Los Angeles. This is an organization that is like a youth support organization. They do a lot of like scholarships and academic work, and then they also have like sports, music, art. It's just like wraparound services for this one community in Los Angeles, which is a really, really cool place. I worked in the visual arts department, working on this public art residency that was like 15 middle school, high schoolers, 2 established artists, 4 emerging artists, like 2 staff people. It was like this whole thing. We paper mache'd these huge sculptures and painted them. That's 6 gallons of wood glue and 50 feet of chicken wire, and like all of my clothes are now covered in glue. It's amazing. It was really cool to bust out of the museum. I really, really wanted to do this. It was important for me to do this summer, to go somewhere that was outside of like the institution. And it was interesting seeing how like these kids like consider this space their home. And it's just not like, I'm used to like in a museum, you know, you have these outreach programs going to these places, but like being in the institution where people are contacting us, trying to get us to come out to them, like is kind of an interesting thing to be on the other end of it. And there's so much creativity and like such important impacts that these organizations make that I think are very important. So I can talk more about this forever. The next thing I learned was like leaving the nest and how to write in new and practical ways. Not writing papers anymore, folks. So I wrote a press release for the first time. I wrote social media posts. I wrote a gallery proposal for an exhibition that maybe in 3 to 5 years will become a reality. We'll see. And I also wrote a collections management system that was not a part of my job at all, but I realized that they had no idea what objects were in that exhibit, and that was a problem. So I photographed them, which I'm not a professional photographer, and I did a new intake form for that, which was a really great experience. Let's see. The Power of the Public Humanities Alumni Network, the greatest people you'll ever meet, right? So the organizations I worked with in Los Angeles, both my supervisors were alumna of the program, and they were such valuable resources. They're both so invested in my success. Nara, who worked with me at Heart of Los Angeles, found me a place to live for free in Los Angeles when I needed a place to stay, going above and beyond to support my work and make sure I was having a valuable experience, and trusting me too, because there's an established level of trust that it was a really great experience. And this is from the alumni event here. And number 5, juggling multiple projects is possible if you have a plan. Committing without a plan, it's a trap. Don't do it. Flexibility is important. It requires frequent stretching. All of these projects had a plan, but plans change, and it's important that you can be flexible. And graduate school is short, and you should take advantage of it. Yeah. So that's a wrap for me. Yeah. Any questions on any multiple parts of this?
I'd like to hear more about the Los Angeles organization.
Yeah.
So that's the one with 4.5 staff?
Yeah, so the visual arts department is 2 full-time staff and then an intern, and then they have a team of volunteers, and they also have rotating teaching artists that are different cohorts that change. And this was a really, really amazing experience, a great organization, the coolest kids I've ever met in my entire life. You can see a bunch of them here. And just, it was such a creative and wonderful space to be in. Did you have a specific question about?
So do they give lessons? Is it
Oh, yeah.
art lessons? Is it
Yeah, so the
exhibits?
visual arts department, they offer classes, and the classes are in all different mediums, and they're taught by established artists from Los Angeles, and oftentimes artists that are from the neighborhood as well, which is really great. And they also do public art residencies where they bring in I guess professional artists, and they do a lot of field trips. So every Thursday I got to go on a field trip, which is a great way to live your life. I recommend it. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, hello everyone. So this summer I was at the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance in Chicago, which is home for me. And just as a disclaimer, all of the photo backgrounds are the opening day of the exhibit that I worked on. So everything looks very beautiful and put together versus how the whole summer actually went. So my first bit is that you have to improvise and really work fast and with what you've got. So there were already systems in place in terms of how they ran things and how they did things. So I had to really, work from what I already knew, and that was, I guess, a lesson in itself that I was I know a lot. And also be able to not beat myself up about the fact that if we didn't get all the details that I wanted for someone's specific story, that was actually just how it was going to be put up on the wall, because the exhibition date got pushed twice while I was there. 2 is that setting matters. So the exhibit was specifically around Puerto Rican migration to Chicago. So I've really just been thinking about questions of how successful this exhibit would have been elsewhere, right? It worked because it was a community effort, and people in the community were in the exhibit. There's talks right now of modifying the exhibit so that it can travel. So I'm thinking about how it's going to be understood and read differently as they bring it somewhere like the East Coast, and if it will be as successful. You'll make a lot of people happy, and you'll also have that one person complain about that one thing, and that's okay. You know, even opening day, I'm obviously thinking of something very specific right now, but you are working with so many people's timelines. The exhibit ended up covering 18 photographs and 21 people's migration stories. So that means that I'm only working with what people are actually giving me. So sometimes they already had their collected stories, but I was like, this is missing this detail. I need like this information. So I would call people up and be like, okay, like where are you at? I'll come meet you right now. I'll interview you right now, and like let's make this happen. If that wasn't the case, then their story may have not included their daughter in it, and they may have been upset about that. How to curate under someone else's vision while still trying to keep some of your vision alive. So although I ended up being the curator for the entire exhibit, this project already existed before I got there. So they had an idea of what they wanted covered in the exhibit, and they knew that they wanted it to specifically focus on the process of migration. What was that experience on the plane? What was that experience first getting off the plane? While I may have wanted to include other tidbits such as what was your experience with, you know, more like racially related things, or arts or spaces that you found community in. So I snuck in bits of that, but still keeping in mind that that wasn't the overarching of what they wanted, was, you know, an experience. And people show up, and that's pretty amazing. There was a lot of people at the opening of the exhibit. I mean, you would expect so because it's a lot of photographs, meaning that's a lot of community members, and those community members have huge families. So it was amazing to see how excited people were to see their stories like on the walls, which was really like the best part. But yeah, thank you.
So did you learn more things when the people came and looked at the exhibit? Will there be any way to put things, will you be able to get the daughter back in? Yeah. Or is it set and then?
Yeah, so, and actually the daughter situation is interesting because, so what happened was that she was not able to be present for the photograph either. There was also community members chosen to be paid photographers for these portraits. So because she wasn't included in there, because she didn't mention her in the story, she was nowhere to be found. So we are adding her as like a tidbit like in the label oral story, but so we'll include her in that sense. And then there was another part to your question.
Were there other people who had tidbits?
Oh yeah, so there was also a part of the opening exhibit that was really awesome because we had a few people go up and just talk. And they explained, you know, different parts of their experiences, and some of it was already in the label and some of it wasn't, and also even if it was, it's a whole different story to hear it out loud than read it on an exhibit label. So
I'm always amused because I have the same reaction. It's public humanities, and then when you work by yourself, you work with the community, and then all of a sudden you open it and all these people come and you're so surprised and gratified, and you're like, it's in the title. I mean, but still.
Yeah, no, it's still, because I was in some ways very much in my own world of like doing the research, and even though I was talking with them, I was like, are people actually going to come? Is this all for something, you know? So it ended up being great.
Thank you.
So I'm Julia, and my presentation is entitled Reconciling the Reflections of a Wedding Cake House Elf, which for reasons that will hopefully soon become evident. But I was here in Providence this summer, splitting my time between two local organizations that I'll describe a bit because they're both very small and also around here, so hopefully you'll get involved. The first was the Center for Reconciliation, which is based out of the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, but the mission is to explore the history and legacy of slavery and systemic racism in Rhode Island and in the country in general. And they're primarily doing that through public programs right now, but there's a long-term goal of having a museum. But Elon Cook-Lee, who's a graduate of this program, is the program director and curator. So she's the only full-time staff member, and she's not actually even full-time, so pretty small. And then the other place I was the Dirt Palace at the Wedding Cake House. So pictured here are Xander and Pippi. They're two artists, administrator, visionaries who founded the Dirt Palace, which is a feminist artist collective in Olneyville in 2000. But they've now undertaken the kind of restoration reimagining of a Italian Victorianate mansion on Broadway. And they're turning that into a artist residency and bed and breakfast and exhibition space. So again, Xander and Pippi are the only kind of full-time people working on this project. So in both situations, I was like the plus one. So yeah, I guess my first lesson is that implausibly, impressively enormous projects require ambitious visions. Obviously, both these projects are very ambitious, and many thoughtful short-term goals. So I think this is kind of going to what Ryan was saying earlier, that you can't think about the big picture every day and every hour, because otherwise you'll get incredibly overwhelmed. But you do need to be very thoughtful about how you're managing your time. So the Center for Reconciliation, I think they'd mostly done like 2 programs in a month before. This summer we were doing 2 programs in a week. So obviously this was kind of our summer agenda, which was ambitious. And then Wedding Cake House, they're both undergoing a renovation, but also producing an exhibition with 150 works of art. And both of those things are supposed to happen in February. So, well-designed, consistently maintained organizational tools are critical. So I'm a big fan of Trello as a work management tool for team projects. That's just me. That's a screenshot of the Wedding Cake House one. The thing on the left is a tool that my coworker Carrick and I made at the Center for Reconciliation that I'm not actually that convinced is going to be helpful. I guess my 2 kind of adjectives there, well-designed and consistently maintained. I mean, the kind of flip side of having organizational tools is if no one wants to use them, and if they're more hassle to maintain than to actually use, then they're not a good use of anyone's time. So, keep that in mind, I guess. Oh, well, that's too bad. The last word here got cut off, but it's you are your own best and first resource. So I kind of learned this by example from Elon, Xander, and Pippi, who are all just kind of like, I've never done it before, so what? Let's do it. This is a screenshot of one of my personal triumphs of the summer, which is figuring out how to embed a Google Calendar in the Center for Reconciliation website to schedule walking tours. I just basically got really frustrated that it didn't exist and was like, I'm just going to teach myself how to do this. And I did it. So, sometimes frustration is helpful for motivating you to just figure it out. Also, understand what you can and cannot change. So this is a photo of a program that ended up taking place in late July. It was at the Center for Reconciliation. It was originally scheduled for early July in the same 2-week span as 2 other programs. And in early July, nothing had really happened for this program. We were all stressed out about it, and I just said to Elon, like, is there a reason this has to happen on July 12th instead of like July 28th? And she was like, actually, no. Like, let's just, issue an updated press release. That's basically it. And I mean, the downside was that we hadn't done anything for the program, and then by shifting it back, that became the upside because we didn't have to change anything, because we hadn't done anything. So, so it ended up being a really wonderful program in late July. And then, above all else, consistently support and celebrate your collaborators. So Pippi and Xander have been working in Providence for the last 18 years. They get a lot of the work done in the house through volunteers. They have volunteer work days, and they're really incredible about recognizing volunteer contributions. Kind of another element of that is on the right is a pencil line portrait done of me. So basically, they commissioned an artist to do portraits of everyone who has worked on this iteration of the house that are gonna hang in perpetuity in the house as recognition of labor. Exactly. I know, it's like beautiful. So, so yeah, I really learned, and then on the left, Elon kind of recruited community members to be performers during this event. In any case, both of these organizations are great at working with people over long periods of time and really recognizing them. And then this is me being a wedding cake house elf squatting in a fireplace. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Did you find yourself leaning towards one? You're like preferring one over another? I think in like more your future aspirations.
think, I mean, the projects are actually, I mean, they seem disparate, but they're also actually pretty similar in terms, or both are actually pretty like social justice oriented or kind of like politically conscious, and both are also kind of 1 or 2 woman shows. So I think for me, and I also have kind of I guess it probably would behoove me if I was leaning more towards one or the other, but instead I'm like, oh, I still like all the things that I've always liked, like history and art, you know, like a public programming and curation. So I don't know. That's I continue to wish to have it all, but thank you for, yeah. Okay, cool, thank you.
Hi, my name is Erin Aoyama, and this summer my practicum was at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which was a museum and a memorial that sits at the site of one of the 10 concentration camps that incarcerated Japanese Americans during World War II. So this was my first time working at a museum ever, so I learned a lot of things. But I think kind of the top 5 most important things are these. So first of all, at a small museum like Heart Mountain, which has 4 full-time staff members, and then there were 5 volunteers or interns who kind of cycled in throughout the summer. So at a museum that small, that sees about 18,000 visitors annually at least, everyone has to jump in. Everyone kind of has to be able to do almost everything, from running the cash register to orienting visitors when they arrive and introducing the film that we show, to cleaning the bathrooms, dealing with any kind of maintenance issues that come up or technical issues. So that was a steep learning curve from the beginning, but made it really fun and interesting, and every day then was pretty different. The second thing I learned, I think also the first day I started thinking about this, was balancing coming in as someone who studies Japanese American incarceration pretty deeply, kind of balancing that expertise, I guess you could call it, with the folks who work there full time or who are there every summer from the area, who know a lot about a lot of our visitors and the function of the museum and the community and that kind of stuff, but less about the history. So balancing kind of sharing what I know and what I think is important to tell with the expertise that my fellow staff and volunteers had as well. So that was really interesting, and I think a good reminder that the world outside of academia has, is very different, and that there needs to be a balance between, what I am thinking about and arguments that I'm trying to make all the time in class to what we're sharing with folks who come in to see the museum. Third, I think related to that was just experiencing the visitors that came in over the course of my time at Heart Mountain, which were a mix of, people who had family in camp, whether it was at Heart Mountain or one of the other camps, or families who were visiting Yellowstone for vacation and drove past our museum and saw the sign and were curious and came in, to local folks who remember the camp being there or who lived in some of the barracks that remained on the land even after the war was over. And sometimes you'd have these folks come in at the same time, and you'd be talking to all of them at the same time and answering questions and things like that. And it was really interesting. It showed me how important it was to really listen to folks and see what they're bringing in with them, because this was a museum where sometimes people walked in with a completely blank slate, but even so, even when they did walk in and know nothing about the history, that brings a certain attitude with it as well. So just the importance of, adjusting to visitors and really listening to the experiences that they're carrying with them as they came in. I was also working on an exhibit for the museum that will open in May, and this brought a lot of learning experience with it, but I think the importance of space, both the physical space that our exhibit will go up in, ends up dictating a lot about what's possible. And we're working on an exhibit about music, and so I wanted to be able to incorporate some sound and some of the instruments and things that were used at camp, and thinking about, okay, we have this one small room where folks are going to be walking around. How do you have sound in there without distracting from everything else? But also sort of thinking about space in terms of what is available in the archive at Heart Mountain, what they have to include in the exhibit, and then what is worthwhile to try to get on loan from other places like the Japanese American National Museum or some of the other museums that exist at other camps. So navigating kind of wanting to have a lot from Heart Mountain, but also trying to figure out what's going to be important enough that it's worth getting from another place. And I think lastly, I was really struck by over the summer, and then as I've been reflecting about my practicum, the importance of having people working within the public humanities in a place like Wyoming. Heart Mountain has a hard time getting full-time staff there because you have to move to Wyoming. The pay's not great. Wyoming is beautiful, but it's very cold during the wintertime, and where Heart Mountain is pretty isolated. So, to have a really dedicated staff is what makes the museum run. But also I got the chance to explore some of the other museums in the area, and just seeing how much it adds to the local landscape and to the kind of community itself to have folks who are committed to teaching about this history working within these public-facing, public-serving institutions. It goes a long way in some of these places, and I think I was just really struck by how meaningful it was to be in Wyoming and be at this place and this museum. And also, how much it meant to visitors as they came in, that people work really hard to keep this museum open and as well run as it is. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this was interesting. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Isabella Robbins. This summer I worked at Cantor Art Center at Stanford University. So I went back to the school where I did my undergrad. Previously I had done a little bit of work in the museum and in the Native American gallery there. So it was kind of cool to go back with a new outlook on things. So it's split into two galleries. A lot of their work is Pacific Northwest Coast traditional artwork, so not so much like what you could consider contemporary artwork. I also don't approve of that binary, but just pointing that out here. And then they also have Ancient Americas. When I was there, I randomly curated this case of moccasins, which doesn't fit in at all, so it was also kind of interesting to reevaluate that. So the first thing I learned, though, is that most museums aren't doing Indigenous history art right now. Some places are doing it better, but I think it's kind of a challenge that people are trying to look at and figure out what's the best way to do that. So kind of as an example, before I went here, I was spending time at home in Arizona, and I went to Arizona State Museum. Weird place, has a lot of dioramas, very old school. I would place Cantor kind of in the middle, they have some of this cool stuff, they have some of this contemporary artwork a little bit on the traditional side. And then a museum that's kind of doing it better than most of the other places that I found through my research was Denver Art Museum. They have a very strong commitment to, exhibiting contemporary Native artists of all art mediums and things like that. So I think that was one of the biggest and first lessons I've learned. The second one is donors have a lot of power. They have a lot of say in what goes in the gallery. I think that was kind of a big reality check for me. I had a lot of my museum experience is in these small public art museums that just, or at the Hafenreffer, where sort of just I got a lot of experience doing what I wanted. This gallery, though, is called the Remus Family Gallery. Those are the Remuses. They're very wealthy. They have a lot of education. He went to both Harvard and Stanford. All this stuff, half the stuff in here is on loan from him. So that was pretty interesting. At one point, he emailed the museum and was like, "Oh, I hear you're trying to do a reinstallation. I have all this other stuff. Do you want it?" kind of. And I was like, I don't know. And he claims that there's all this weird political things that are kind of interesting that I learned about. The third one is visit other museums and institutions to help you understand yours better. I was able to visit a lot of other places in the Bay Area. So I went to the DeYoung Museum. I went to Mission Dolores. I went to the California Indian Museum in Santa Rosa. But this is the DeYoung and the California Indian Museum, the Mission Dolores. And they both kind of talk about Indigenous histories. The De Young is like an encyclopedic museum. It was really interesting because they had done this really big, kind of on the last topic too, they had done this really big reinstallation, but their big reinstallation, which was supposed to be like this, huge, new thing, was very similar to what we had installed in our gallery. So it's sort of like, at what pace are people moving? And what kind of staff do they have? The De Young has a curator and assistant curator of Indigenous art. A lot of places, the Mission Dolores has one curator. It's also like a church. It's a very weird, creepy place, in my opinion. So that was kind of cool to just see other people's places to see what they're doing. The fourth one is some museums have some really good people working in them, with them. A couple of people, so these two women on the top are my supervisors, and they are not necessarily Indigenous art people. They're more in academic engagement. That's sort of just who I got matched up with, but they have really good intentions, and this is something that they're trying to make a priority, I think sort of more on like the ground level. They got a new director, Susan Dackerman, who used to work for the Harvard Art Museums, and I think it's kind of being pushed slowly more onto her plate, so it's that was a good thing. And then some of my previous mentors from my time there is Karen Beesman and Denny Woodward. They've been super helpful in just like keeping the museum, like making this a priority. So it was cool to see that, and that's still happening. And then finally, Indigenous collections and representation is important. Like on one of the last days that I was there, somebody left this note, and it was just like, thanks for keeping this work here. Like, it's really cool. And I think that was sort of reassuring because I was very jaded. I did a lot of research on art museums, and a lot of it was kind of upsetting in some ways and just sad that it's not really like, a priority to a lot of museums. But to know that museum visitors and stuff like that really are interested in this stuff and really want to see it made me happy and gave me a little bit of hope. So, yeah, thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about what your vision of doing Indigenous art right would look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was doing this summer was sort of answering that question for myself. I was able to read a lot of stuff. I think one of the biggest like helpers and like helping me think about that was Decolonizing Museums, which is a book by Amy Lonetry. And basically the only museums that are really doing it right, it seems, or like close to right, is a lot of tribal museums. So it's like, I think it doesn't always have to be a tribal museum, but having an Indigenous person there is super important. Additionally, it's not gonna happen if it's like an AOA curator. So, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, like you're asking somebody to do half the world, if not more. And a lot of museums have curators like that. And that's just like, you have to have people committed to this, and your museum also has to commit to making that a priority. So I think doing that and then having a very like, not strong, but definitely having Indigenous voices in those positions of power, and then not just, I think there was one thing that was like not just consultants, but the curators, the people leading the charge. So I think that's definitely going to be something. And I think also last thing is that there does need to be not only this like ethnographic thing, but I think there's a way that people can accurately do that with these like traditional art forms, with contemporary art and stuff like that, without completely isolating contemporary artists and things like that. But it's hard. So, cool. Yeah.
I'm sure this is a lot, but can you talk a little bit more about that traditional contemporary binary and what you can say beyond the growth of it?
Yeah, I think a lot of times like there's traditional Native art, which is oftentimes what people think of as like baskets or rugs, thinking about Navajo stuff, that would be baskets and rugs, whereas like contemporary might be, paintings or performance art and stuff like that. And I think that binary can get really dangerous because that sort of decides what goes in the art museum versus what goes in the anthropology museum. And I think that's really problematic for a lot of reasons, but I think also it's just really isolating. And I think, yeah, there's definitely ways to do it right. I also think there's a lot of people who are making traditional art forms now but in a contemporary moment with contemporary styles and things like that. But it's very much like being put in this other context where it would also fit in this other way. And I just think that that just further like the divide between like you're either a contemporary person, indigenous person, or you're a traditional person. And it's like, that's just the identity crises that me and my peers have had are like, because of these constructs that come about in all these different ways are really bad in a lot of ways. I hope that makes sense. It's complicated, but yeah, thank you. Okay, so my name's Allie. So this is 5 things I learned this summer at Mount Vernon. So this is George Washington's Mount Vernon. So if you guys don't know, this is his home that he built. So he lived here before the Revolution. It was his father's house. He didn't live there during his presidency, but after when he retired. So the first thing that I learned this summer was to take advantage of every opportunity. So these are just some pictures. I worked a lot this summer. I know you guys did a lot of different jobs. I worked too much where my boss was like, why are you still here? Go home. But I wanted to soak up any opportunity that I could. So these 2 pictures are from our Teacher Institute that I was a part of this summer. So we got a behind the scenes after hours of the US Capitol. And then I also got to meet and feed Michael Twitty. So if you guys don't know, he's a food historian. He's really popular and really big, but I got to feed him. So that was like the highlight of my summer. This is the second thing, so teach me versus STEM. I think you guys all know what STEM is. Working at Mount Vernon, it's typically history. And I think history gets left out a lot now with the push more towards technology and math. But I think Mount Vernon does a really good job trying to also incorporate science within them too to be relevant. So Teach Me stands for Technology, Engineering, Arts, Civics, History, Mathematics, and Economics. So it's actually, it's a mouthful, but it's perfect and it's not trademarked, but it was just made by Sam Murphy, who leads historic trades there. So he runs the mill. I don't think my video will work, but the mill, maybe. No, but the mill, it was like a video of the mill turning, but he works, Oh, okay, well, that's okay. I don't know what I just did or how to go back. That's okay, I'll just start over. You guys talked about improvise, right? That's a key skill to have. Yeah, so it's a really cool thing, and I had one of the scholars for the residential program be like, please email me the acronym because it's genius. And it teaches a lot of important things that get missed out. Maybe. Nope, okay, hold on. Why are you not changing? Okay, that's a good idea. Let's try it. Okay, get out of here. Sorry, guys. Okay, but it's not. Did the cable go? Yes, I need help.
Oh.
Yeah, see,
it's showing 2 different things.
Because it's fine up there.
Is it frozen?
I don't know. Now go. Okay, I can do it this way. Okay. Maybe? Did it go, Maddie? Okay. Sorry. Number 3, allow yourself to take chances and value your own work. So as a lot of you know, I had a really tough first year here in the program, trying to figure out my purpose and where I belonged in this field. And I found my internship with Mount Vernon really quickly, and that kind of scared me too because maybe I was missing out on something else. Maybe I was settling, but Mount Vernon was the perfect place for me this summer. I think it revitalized me and was the best supportive environment for me in this journey that I'm on. So I got to run, develop, implement, and evaluate my own 2-day teacher workshop for local teachers on diverse and inclusive narratives when teaching history. So this is a picture from, these 2 pictures are from my program, and then that one is from our social media of me teaching my primary documents workshop. So I think my boss and my staff really helped foster growth in me and allowed me to take chances. 4, so networking is crucial and beneficial to the future. I'm sure you guys all know that. You guys have met some really great people. For me, I got to work with the Piscataway tribe out of Maryland, and that was a really beneficial experience for me because I've never really worked with Native peoples before. So it's kind of feeling the importance of incorporating that into a classroom. I got to meet a lot of different famous historians and scholars and go out to dinner with them and really form my own network that I can appreciate and use after Mount Vernon. And the 5th one was appreciate the opportunity and enjoy the work you do. Like I said before, I was a little lost, and I think Mount Vernon was the best place and best choice for me, and it allowed me to kind of figure out what I would like to do later in this. So, okay, that is it. There was a videos, but that didn't work out. That's okay. Yeah.
What did you feed Michael Twitty?
So Michael Twitty was running late because Michael Twitty always runs late. I was like, yeah. And my boss sent me an email, and she like walked over and was like, Michael's gonna need to have lunch. You need to get him lunch. And I was like, what? Come again? And she was like, you need to order food from the restaurant. So we have a restaurant at Mount Vernon, and he needed roast beef. And I was like, got it, I'm on it. This is like the biggest task. So I called down, they don't have roast beef at our inn. And so I said to my boss, I was like, I can't get him anything else but roast beef. Like, I can't mess this up. So we had to like order a sandwich from another place. He got there so late he couldn't eat before he gave his talk. So he gave his talk, and then afterwards my boss set him up in a room with his colleague. And my boss said, you're not going on the next, we had a mansion tour with the teachers. She's like, you're not going on this tour. You're gonna go sit in there while he eats. And I was like, okay, great. So I sat there while Michael Twitty ate his sandwich. Yes, I talked. I just sat there awkwardly. We had one of our like enslaved interpreters there, and so she was like doing a lot of the talking, but just to like sit in the presence of Michael Twitty was really cool.
Did you like the sandwich?
He did. He liked the sandwich, and he really liked me. And like in my, not to toot my own horn, but in the picture, I speak Wolof, and it's a language only spoken in Senegal and Gambia. And so he signed my book, Nagadef, and it was like, how are you, and stuff. So it was like a little connection that we had. So it's cool.
Thanks, guys. All right. Hi, guys. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maddie Mott. I'm a second-year grad student in the Public Humanities program. So this summer, I stayed in Providence, and I was working at the Roger Williams Park Conservancy, which is a startup nonprofit in the south side of Providence, which is tasked with stewarding, marketing, and activating the Roger Williams Park in partnership with the Providence Parks Department. I chose to work here instead of a small museum, which I have thoroughly branded myself as being interested in, just because I thought the lessons I could learn working at a startup space that's trying to get itself off the ground would be really invaluable to my career. So in structuring my program, I wanted to gain experience and skills I don't necessarily have a lot of experience in. So I did a lot of work with development beyond grant writing, which was what my background was in, but also neighbor engagement and public programming and finding ways to allow neighbors of the park to collaboratively steward the organization. And I did that and then some, because as you'll learn, a tiny nonprofit has a lot of difficulty. So I wanted to present 5 things I learned about working at a small organization. I thought I knew these things because I had done this before, but I didn't. So number 1, partnerships are critical. I don't think I need to spend time justifying why it is important to be collaborative, but what I will stress is that collaborative relationships for small nonprofits are important, are like extra critical just because they need those collaborators in order to achieve their mission. Often from what I've seen working at other small institutions, any job task that isn't putting out daily fires often gets swept to the side. And so taking the time to mingle and find potential collaborators often does not get done. So what I learned is let that fire burn an extra day and make the time to find people to work with. Redefine what realistic means. Before I came to Brown, I was working at a small museum with 3 staff people. And we were able to get a lot of stuff done with just 3 people. So I had a relatively foolish idea of what a realistic workload looks like. Starting at the Park Conservancy, which has 1 full-time staff person, really made me change my mind about what a realistic workload is and what is a realistic expectation of what a small nonprofit can do. Small nonprofits can't move mountains, and that's okay. And I think it's also important to think about this in terms of workload and what a fair labor practice looks like for small nonprofit people, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The third thing I learned was to embrace experimentation. Small nonprofits don't like risk. They don't like to fail. It's really scary. But experimentation does not have to be a major financial risk. It can just be something small, just trying something new. Because this was the Park Conservancy's first real summer, everything we were doing from programming to structural decisions we were making was an experiment. And I think what was really cemented for me this summer was how much I value being able to be in a space where trying new things is encouraged, is supported. You aren't gonna get maybe fired for trying something new. So I think that was something that was really important to me that I value in future workplaces. The fourth thing I learned is that adaptability is an important skill and probably the most important skill for people interested in working in small nonprofits. Small nonprofit people wear many hats, as you all know. So not only was I a fancy graduate intern from Brown, not only was I trying to curate the Betsy Williams Cottage, not only was I trying to find ways to raise money, sometimes I had to walk a goat. This is Jean Raphael. He's one of 3 goats that the Providence Parks Department owns. Walking a goat's really hard, by the way. They're super, super naughty. I think what set me up for success in this position and will set anyone else up for success in a small nonprofit is being able to rapidly switch between all of those different roles and more importantly, not having an ego about it. Being able to recognize yes, I am in charge of fundraising right now, but sometimes I just gotta walk this goat. And then my last thing, and this is probably my biggest piece of advice for the first years who are going to start thinking about their summer practicums. The second years, as we're about to go back on the job market, your practicum is not your whole life. Your job is not your whole life. And public humans, we tend to be so passionate about the work we do, we care so much that we trap ourselves, we have no work-life balance, and that really negatively affects us in the long run. So what I encourage the first years to do and the second years to do, either at their practicums or at their first jobs, is practice drawing those boundaries, giving yourself realistic work expectations, and recognizing that we're also divided on if it's okay to say no, if we just say yes all the time. But my recommendation is it's okay to say no. Don't fall. I was in the trap before I came to Brown of my whole life was this tiny museum. And after working at another small nonprofit, it's really important to me not to fall back into that trap. And I encourage you all to do the same. So thanks so much. I was right at 5 minutes, which is great. Any questions? Yeah.
What are the other goats' names?
So there's Jean Raphael, there was Salvador, and then my personal favorite was Vincent van Gogh.
That was the name though, right?
I think so, yeah.
So
Did you participate, Susan?
Yeah, I didn't think I put in the name, but a bunch of people did.
Well, Vincent van Gogh was by far the best one. Yeah. So here's the fun thing. So historically, the Roger Williams Park was in its heyday in the 20s to the 30s, and there used to be a herd of 100 sheep. And there was an official park shepherd, and they were basically the lawnmowers, right? So his job was to take his flock across the park, right? So Obviously, there's no more sheep. But because the Roger Williams Park has kind of fallen into decay in the 70s and the 80s, there's a lot of like poison ivy, invasive plants, et cetera, that are on the trails. So they got the goats to eat the poison ivy, the blackberry bush, et cetera. The whole flaw in this problem is that the goats are scared of everything. People, dogs, cars, skateboards, bikes, everything that's in the park. They're like, ugh. So we have to practice walking them around the botanical center so they like get used to things existing outside of them. You're welcome. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
I'm so glad I was able to impart wisdom and goat knowledge on everyone.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Jackson. And this summer, I was at the American History Museum in DC. I worked with my mentor/supervisor who had recently just moved from NAMAC, the African American History and Culture Museum. So a lot of the lessons that I learned actually came from her experience there, if I'm being honest. But I'll get into that. So the first lesson/reoccurring theme that continued to be brought up over the course of my internship was curatorial approaches to developing exhibitions. My mentor talked a lot about how some curators have top-down approaches, so they start with an overall message and then find objects and material culture to support that message, or they are bottom-up, meaning they start with objects and material culture and generate a message based off of what those objects/material cultures reveal. That's important to know, especially when you're co-curating exhibitions with curators, because if you're top-down and you're working with someone who's bottom-up, sometimes themes and messages can get lost. The second lesson, she was always talking about how objects are living agents. Objects reveal something, a story, a question, a message. They don't just simply fill in a blank. So a lot of the exercises we would do, I had the opportunity to sit in on a lot of design meetings. They're actually curating an exhibition on American girlhood that's going to open up in 2020. So I was in a lot of the design meetings. And something that we did often was we would just pull out pictures and objects that were going to be a part of the exhibition and figure out if we could tell a history, a cohesive story without any text being present. So that was a really cool exercise and kind of made me think about objects in a completely different way than I had prior to. The third lesson did not necessarily come from my mentor, but came from a fellow intern who was actually working in graphic design. She was reading this book called Fostering Empathy in Museums. And the core theme of the book was that empathy is a combination of like experiential feelings based off of high and low, negative or positive emotional vibrations. So if you have high negative emotional vibrations, that produces something like anger or fear. High positive would be happiness or joy. Low negative would be sadness, solemn. Low positive would be contentment or peace. And some of the best museums are the ones who are able to hit all of the boxes and kind of take you on that emotional journey. And so when I was discussing this with my supervisor, she thought that the African American History and Culture Museum was a key example of this actually working. For instance, she curated the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, and once you finish that exhibition, you're overcome with a lot of anger or fear or sadness. But when you walk out, there's a contemplative court for you to go and kind of decompress a little bit, and so then you're able to find some contentment and peace, right? So they're trying to hit all of the boxes to make sure that it's a well-rounded experience, emotional experience for you, I guess. Lesson 4. Instead of curators asking to define, or instead of asking curators to define takeaway messages, when conceptualizing exhibitions, what would it mean for them to define a key question? This came up a lot during meetings. My mentor sat on a board that reviewed new exhibitions that were in the works. And one of the things that they asked the curators to bring to them was like a key message. But something that kept coming up over the course of the meetings is, why are we asking them to define a message for the audience? Why would it not be better for the audience to come up with their own takeaway message or answer to a question that is posed to them? And I thought that was really interesting. And then lesson 5, network, make friends, have a lot of fun. My mentor loved just throwing me into situations where, say I was gonna be intimidated from meeting like this top-notch curator that I was like, oh my gosh, she did the so-and-so exhibit at this museum. My mentor would be like, go talk to her. Get away from me, go network, meet people, have fun. So a lot of the interns and I would go to happy hours because that was a thing in DC and I miss that a lot. So we went to this really cool place that was like an adult playground basically. So the meme says, don't grow up, it's a trap. And I agree. And then my mom came to visit me, so that was great. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Questions? Yeah.
Did you find that like a lot of the lessons your mentor or supervisor was bringing from the map were like things that were also happening in American history, or were there like differences in work styles?
So that was not necessarily happening in American history. I think NMAC was interesting in that that was a museum that literally started from scratch, like in terms of object collection, in terms of messaging, like it had been a while, especially since a Smithsonian institution had started from scratch with anything. So contemporary collecting was something that was a big part of what NMAC was doing, that American history is still a little bit more traditional in their collections approach and in their exhibition process. So I saw her fighting to try to bring in what she had learned at NMAC into American history. And if I'm being honest, she got a lot of pushback because people have been doing things in American history a certain way for a long time. So it's going to be a while before people can adjust to a new way of doing things. Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay, so I did my summer practicum at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and I was working with their public programs and community engagement departments. So the first lesson I learned is that a museum can exist outside of its walls. So this summer was a weird time for the Studio Museum. They're embarking on like a 3 to 4 year construction project where they're building a new space. So it was the first summer where we didn't have access to the actual physical museum, and we needed to do our programs elsewhere. So we did a lot of programs at sites around Harlem, which you can see on this map. Worked with different organizations, and really we were just around New York City. So these are some images of programs we did this summer, which I could get into later what they actually entailed, but you can see some of the partnerships like New York Public Library, WNYC, we're in Marcus Garvey Park, Schomburg. So it was like really dynamic, and it felt super collaborative all summer, which was cool. Number 2, partnerships should be mutually beneficial. So this sort of model of like programming is really heavily dependent on partnerships, and we wanted to be intentional about not being the larger institution that sort of comes in and co-ops space and then just leaves. So we wanted it to be an exchange. So these images are from a party we threw at the Langston Hughes House, and we were really thinking about sort of the levels of reciprocity in this event, and so we thought about like blasting their events on our like social media platforms, and so it felt a little more equal and less like, okay, cool, thanks, now bye. So that was a cool lesson to learn. Number 3, cultural specificity doesn't define audience. So the Studio Museum is a culturally specific institution. It collects and represents, it collects works of the African diaspora. It represents contemporary artists of African descent. And so I kind of imagined going in that would be like the target visitor audience as well. And while that's a super diverse audience, it wasn't necessarily true that all visitors were coming from that community. So we had international visitors, local New Yorkers, like sort of art history scene people, and it was really hard to pin down who was going to come to our programs. Probably had some, pros to that and also some cons when you're trying to think about what you are in a community and what you mean to be in Harlem, which is a super diverse space in itself. These are pictures from the first program I worked this summer. I didn't know who was going to come, and it was pretty diverse, like intergenerational and people of different backgrounds, and that was kind of telling for the rest of the summer as well. Okay, number 4, the size of an institution impacts your role. So this was my first time working at a medium-sized institution with a small team, so like 3 of us, and we were doing a ton of programs this summer, which meant that people wore like a lot of hats, or in the case of Ray J, like 1 hat in several different positions. And that's really how I would like define my summer. So like 1 minute I could be drafting like partnership agreements, the next minute I'm doing social media, the next minute I'm peeling stickers off of lamps. Like these were all the tasks that sort of seemed disparate, but all of the elements came together to make these programs, and then like we could see the fruits of our labor in like the people who came and had a good time. And so it was a really rewarding experience. And then last lesson would be that people come for more than just the objects. So one of the series that we did this summer was called Uptown Fridays. And we did the last Uptown Friday in the building before it was like torn down. And at this point, it's like no art on the walls. It's like raining. I'm like, no one's gonna come to this. Like, who comes to a museum when there's nothing to see? But it was packed out, like 500 people, as you can see, wall to wall. And I can show you some more pictures of that. And it really made me think about like what a museum can be outside of the things it has in its space. And so all these people came for some reason, right? Whether it's like memories or like a vibe or to have a good time. And I think that's important for museums to recognize and actually embrace. And maybe that goes against like museum purist thinking, but I think, I don't know, it's kind of the future maybe, I don't know. So yeah, that is my presentation. Any questions? Yeah, Julia? I guess I'm curious just because when you showed that screenshot at the beginning with like alternate event spaces, they seem mostly focused in Harlem, but then you're also partnering with institutions throughout the city. So I guess, and I know the name of the museum is Studio Museum of Harlem, right? Or
in Harlem, yeah.
In Harlem. So I guess I'm wondering like how the organization right now is trying to branch out to other parts of the city or not, or how important staying in Harlem is right now when the museum doesn't have a physical space in Harlem. Yeah, so those are really good questions, and that's like sort of what the line of thinking is right now. It's like, what does it mean to be the Studio Museum in Harlem? So there is this new initiative called In Harlem, where all of these programs are happening inside the neighborhoods, and that's really important because the museum's been on 125th Street for maybe like 50 years, but people will admit openly that they haven't done the best job of actually interacting with their like next door neighbors, and that's something they really want to change, especially as they make this like giant new building. So it is important, but also they want to be a part of the larger like New York City cultural arts scene. So the focus is in Harlem, but also like elsewhere as well, I guess. Yeah. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So as you all see, I took the 5 slides a little too literally, so I don't have a title slide. But as I think most of you know, I'm Emma Boast, and I worked this summer with the National Public Housing Museum in Chicago, which is a new museum in that it actually hasn't even opened yet. It should be opening sometime in 2019 if fundraising goes according to plan. So it was a really interesting time to be at an organization.
So I'm going to talk a bit broadly about, I think, some values that I picked up from the people at NPHM, because it's a really amazing museum, but it's really amazing in part because of the people who work there. They are brilliant. You know, it's a staff of maybe 3 full-time plus a couple of folks who work part-time. But learning kind of from them what they value has really helped me think about how museums can change and how to think of a museum from the ground up. So coming into this, I was a bit jaded, honestly, about archives and objects and all of these like static things, which are worth critiquing. But I remembered that I really love archives. So I got to spend some time in the archives in Chicago. And you know, they do have a lot to teach us. Obviously, there are extreme gaps in most archives, but this quote on the right, I think, reveals a lot about what we can learn from them. So it says, "Aesthetes who condemn the project's exterior design as sterile, monotonous, etc., making no allowance for the facts that restricted funds have been allocated, mainly to make the apartments as spacious and livable as possible. All these people, including suburban communities, are responsible for the cut in public housing today." And that's from 1964. But obviously, the archives need to live outside of the archives, so the museum is thinking really creatively about this. This is the work of a local artist named Langston Alston. This piece was in an exhibition, a temporary show that was at the museum while I was there. And this artist has gone into a bunch of archives around the city, but one of the primary sources he uses is the oral history collection that the museum was in some ways really born out of. Current and former public housing residents talking about their experiences living in these buildings, which I should note mostly no longer exist. It's a key reason why this museum is being started. I also found that being in place really helped me make sense of what this museum is about, and not only being in Chicago, but being in the literal building that this museum will live in eventually, which is the former Jane Addams homes on the near west side of Chicago. Simply like walking through and kind of, you can literally see the layers of history and how residents sort of made these spaces their own. That value is really core to what this museum is about, is just the power of place and, again, that experience of moving through space and seeing those layers sort of reveal themselves in real time, even as far as thinking about what that empty space that used to have housing on it might become in the future. This museum is also teaching me that there are a lot of ways to do politics in a museum. Obviously, a lot of museums shy away from advocacy and politics because of concerns about their 501c3 status, but on the left are some objects that I received or that were donated by the Los Angeles Tenants Union that will become part of a sort of ongoing collection of housing resistance materials in the museum eventually. And on the right is a short campaign that the museum did actually pushing for rent control legislation in Illinois. It does not currently exist there. Very simple. This is like not high-tech engagement. There was a laptop. There was a place where you could sign up. There were like buttons and pins, but really effective because everyone in that city right now is in some way grappling with a housing crisis. So yeah, a lot of ways to do politics. And then finally, as I said, the people that you work with are in some ways the most important. Like the mission matters, obviously, and I believe deeply in this museum's mission, but it would not be the museum it is without these like really brilliant, awesome people working on it. And it wouldn't be the museum it is without being in Chicago. So I spent a lot of time also just going to art events, mostly free things that were kind of like happening in the city. And so I think that that's like a compelling reminder for me that, again, being in the place is more important sometimes than the institution. That's it. Questions?
I was wondering if you can talk just a little bit. I know in your blog posts you talked about sort of the way that residents and the community were being sort of engaged or being encouraged to be engaged in the production of this museum that we're in talk about.
Yeah. So it's a
it's a very, for a museum of its size, I should also just say it's a really multifaceted place. They're doing exhibitions, they have this oral history archive. The museum itself was born out of a desire to, on the part of residents of the Jane Addams homes, this one particular building, to preserve the physical structure that they had lived in as Chicago was going through the process of systematically taking down public housing around the city. And folks were like, why can't we have a house museum? Like, why does a house museum have to be this kind of space? So just in kind of like the founding ethos and the folks who were founding it, I think that that has, despite changes in staffing and strategic plans, like that has sort of carried through. The Oral History Archive is really important to that because the museum trains young people who are current and former public housing residents to take those oral histories and add to the archive continually, and engages those folks who are doing the recording and interviewing and such in thinking about new ways to, again, make the archives live. So again, thinking about like bringing that artist in and giving him access to those stories to make his art. And then when the museum eventually opens, they will have a staffing plan that really like puts at the forefront current and former public housing residents as employees, and is really trying to rethink like what a front of house staff and what staffing generally can look like in a museum. So rather than kind of dividing education from, again, like front of house visitor services and security, they want to kind of merge all of these roles as both a way of providing like more meaningful work and also to kind of push back against the idea that you have like this surveillance kind of staff in a museum that exists separate from educators. So those are just some examples, but I'm happy to talk more about it. Yeah.
I'm actually curious if you know if the University of Illinois at Chicago has like any stakes in this, or like if any relationships have been built. I'm just curious because that relationship is really weird.
Yes.
And how that's looking.
Yeah. So yeah, for those who like aren't as familiar with the city, UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, is in like the same neighborhood basically as where the museum will be, and there's not an official partnership in that like this is not a museum founded under the aegis of the university, unlike I think the Hull House Museum, for example, is like actually affiliated with the university. But the director of the museum, Lisa, who's coming to talk soon on the right in that photo, is a professor at UIC. So like, there's definitely a relationship. Also, the sort of urban policy and planning programs at UIC have been producing research that then actually that artist, Langston Alston, has used in his work. So like, there are sort of tangential relationships, but you know, larger questions, I think, obviously about what this museum will do to this neighborhood where there's currently a lot of vacant space, but I'm concerned about redevelopment. So the museum is thinking about their role in that, but I don't know how much of that is going through UIC per se. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm Kristen, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a second-year American Studies PhD and second-year Public Human. This summer, I worked at the intersection of the Providence Community Library, the Center for Public Humanities, and the American Studies Department. Basically, a brief overview is that Susan Smullian and I applied for a grant from the American Studies Association, which we got, a small grant, to help sort of seed what we hope will be a long-term partnership between the center, the American Studies Department, and the Providence Community Library system. So thinking through ways to sort of bring different types of programming and different types of resources to the public community library. So 5 things I learned. The first is important, I think, how to sort of negotiate the needs of multiple stakeholders, both individual and institutional stakeholders. And so this was big for this project, I think, because there were more stakeholders than I think I initially realized. So there were the needs, obviously, and first and foremost, of the patrons of the Providence Community Library who were going to be using these resources, who were going to be going to the programming and events that were happening at the library. So thinking through what they needed, what they wanted. Thinking through sort of the staffing needs and sort of the stakeholder position of the Providence Community Library staff, right? So thinking through availability of space, thinking through what their requirements were going to be for making sure that there was space for these workshops and things to happen. And then thinking through also meetings with faculty that I had. So thinking through faculty sort of as a type of stakeholder in this, and thinking through what types of programming that they wanted to offer to the community, but also their pedagogical goals for their students in creating programming. So there were lots of different sort of registers that this was happening at. Google Drive is an incredibly useful tool. This is not meant to be an ad for Google Drive as much as it is like thinking through the fact that trying to think in a long-term project, as a lot of people have gestured to, how to pass on knowledge and how to make sure that things are organized in ways that they're accessible to people who will come after you, and that it's not your own sort of special quirky system of organization, which to some extent it always will be, but trying to think about I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to organize things so that they were going to be clear and useful, so that the person who was taking over the role of liaison when I was finished this summer knew what had been done and what needed to be done. I learned that it's really always best to think through complicated decisions with others and not to work in a vacuum. There were a number of times in this process when Susan and I were both trying to grapple with the way to handle certain things, and it ended up being a lot easier to talk it out together rather than to sort of sit by myself and think through it on my own. It was really useful. In that same vein, sometimes a quick phone call can handle the work of many, many emails. There were times in sort of coordinating with some of the folks at the PCL that I had just constant back and forth, really long emails where it felt like maybe my intention wasn't being conveyed or that I just wasn't making myself clear. And one time in particular, a like 3-minute phone call just cleared up like 5 or 6 emails, right? It just made everything much easier. And I think also like a way to bump this out and think of it in a broader way is being clear about communication and thinking about the way that different folks communicate and making sure that you're on the same page, like checking in and making sure that this is working. And lastly, and another thing a lot of folks have gestured to, the importance of keeping an eye on long-term goals. When you're working in a long project like this, a 5-year project, it was easy to get sort of bogged down in the details. And while that's an important place to be, it's also important to scale out and think about sort of, to get excited about and keep an eye on sort of the long-term goal. That's all. Questions?
Explain what it was like to visit Knight Memorial Library. We're in the middle of this project. We're thinking through how to do it. And they kept saying, oh, you should come and tour the libraries. And they're like, yeah, we drive by. We got it. We're all in our own brains, And then we go to Knight Memorial Library. And what I learned was, we gotta go.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. It's beautiful. It's in disrepair. It's in need of probably $1 million renovation. It's a lovely space. It's complicated.
$1 million in programming. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I think visiting the branches, I think I've only now been to 3, but of the 9, there are 9 branches in the city. It was important to think about space in this process and also to think about community and neighborhood, right? This was a thing that we grappled with a lot. There's a huge range in terms of audience at the Providence Community Library. There's 9 branches spread across the city, and they're all really different communities. So this was important to keep in mind.
But several people talked about the space told us a story that we didn't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you say something about this community library system? Is it analogous to a public library, or is it different somehow?
Yeah, thank you. I should have clarified that at the beginning. So the PCL and the PPL are 2 different institutions. At one point they were the same, but in 2009 they split. So the Providence Community Library is all of the community branches in the city of Providence. So the one that you all might be familiar with is the one in Fox Point, but there are 8 others. And the PPL, the Providence Public Library, is just that big branch downtown. They only have that sort of one location. And they're sort of institutionally very separate. So they do not share revenue streams. They don't share programming. Like they are.
They don't share budget.
Yeah, they don't share anything. They're different places.
Are they all funded through tax dollars?
No. The PCL is very much funded through, it's sort of a grassroots group.
They have a small grant from the city. They get one small piece of their funding comes from the city when the divorce happened. But they raise money, but not much.
The PPL is definitely where most of the money for public library work in the city of Providence goes from the state level. Okay, thanks.
Thank you all. I imagine you're ready to move on to other things today, but this has been a great session, our longest, and I think in many ways our best. The talks were all really interesting. It's clear that you all engaged on a very deep level with your practicums this summer. And that showed up in the blogs, that showed up in your presentations, and it showed up in the evaluations that I received from your supervisors. So thank you for all of that. I'm glad that this seems to be working on a number of different levels. Steve, do you have anything you want to add?
Fascinating and always interesting to see when you say just pick 5 things, such an amazing range of different kinds of things that you can learn. So it's great to see.
Susan, any final thoughts?
I think we give you all one more round of applause for a great job done this summer.